20-year-old Shelley March stood outside the old mansion, surrounded by overgrown bushes and trees. The imposing building looked eerie and unwelcoming. The house was inherited to Shelley's father, Pete. His great-aunt had died and he was her only distant relative. The mansion was beyond early 19th century extravagance. It was filthy, it constantly creaked and looked as though it had been empty for the past 60 years. "This place is hideous." Shelley was still not over the fact her parents dragged her from LA to live in a rundown rat trap. "Everything's original, you know? All the way from 1920. It won't take us long to fix up." Pete placed his arm around Shelley and playfully dragged her towards the doorway of a large house. As they entered the ornate foyer, they were struck by the intricate details of the architecture and antique furniture. A faded photograph on a nearby table caught their attention, depicting a group of young men and women. It had 1922 engraved on the frame, with one man, a charming and handsome man, standing out from the group. That night, Shelley woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards. She walked down the hallway, the dark and empty mansion feeling eerie and unwelcoming. When she reached the basement, she found and opened an old chest, discovering vintage drug paraphernalia, old photographs and documents revealing the wild S&M parties and debauched activities that went on in the mansion. Newspaper cuttings showed some party regulars were suspects in strange murder cases, and also hundreds of articles on missing persons cases throughout the 1930s. The family gathered in the library the next day. Shelley hesitated to tell the others what she had found the night prior. She thought about mentioning to her mother, who was sat next to her, when Shelley's father found a dusty amateur-made book, titled The March Cult. It described the cult's dark manifesto. Albert March was a rich businessman who was very popular in the social scene of the 1920s. He was secretly an occultist with an obsession with eternal life. There was mention he was linked to several murders in 1928, but there was no evidence to convict him. He disappeared from all social circles and no one knew where he went. The family discussed what they had just read with a macabre curiosity. All but Shelley saw the humorous side, as when they talked, the painting of Albert, the same young handsome man from the photo, caught her attention. It gave her an overwhelming feeling of disassociation from herself. The feeling terrified her. Shelley lay in bed and could not ignore a faint distant sound of a vintage song. It briefly scratched as though it had been playing on an old-fashioned music device. The low drool of music lingered ever so quietly, but yet Shelley could not suffer it. When she went downstairs she could hear it a little clearer. It was when she had reached the basement she discovered a hidden door. She had never noticed it before. It led to a long narrow tunnel that got vertically steep the more Shelley ventured downward. She was scared, but the music was just too enticing. She could not bring herself to pause with a second thought. Down deeper she walked, gripping the wall tightly as not to slip on the damp rocks at her feet. After what had seemed like maybe an hour of negotiating her footing, Shelley saw the end of the tunnel and she could see light. The sound of an old-timely song echoed off the damp, dark walls ever so much more loudly. She had no other choice as to continue toward the curious scene. The wet rocky ground was too slippery for her to climb up the steep path barefooted. However, her curiosity had drowned her better judgment, as when Shelley entered through the stone-chiseled outdoor way, she found herself face to face with the current cult leader, who looked eerily like young Albert March. She realized the cult's presence in the mansion was stronger than ever as she had walked into a time capsule. It was a large hollowed-out cave, decorated with very expensive ornate. The room was filled with at least 70 or so young men and women, all dressed in fashion from the 1920s jazz age, attuned to the weird sexual activities that was going on all around them. People openly flaunted their hedonistic habits without shame, injecting themselves and each other with heroin or morphine, or snorting cocaine off the naked bodies of others while performing the most beastly sexual acts at the same time. The hellish scene was like Babylon from the Bible. Shelley stood in complete shock at what was taking place ahead of her. She was gripped with too many emotions to act in any way. The madness, the chaos, the insanity. She found it hard to comprehend it all in that moment. She couldn't take her eyes away from him, Albert March. With his legs folded, he sat gracefully on a chair, smoking a cigarette. He held his cigarette holder like an artist does his paintbrush. Albert looked blankly at Shelley, and all Shelley could do was glare back silently. At this time everyone had stopped their devilish behavior and were quiet and very still. They all watched Shelley. However, she seemed totally oblivious to the others. Albert had her complete and total attention. No one else existed to her in her mind. Albert moved his cigarette holder rhythmically with the music and took a slow drag, while keeping his eyes locked with Shelley's.
Welcome.
We've been waiting for you.